vote for speaker, please.
Hey, thank you. So to clarify things up, I was supposed to start the workshop across the room, so if you want to go to the workshop, I will just do a small rerun of the talk from Friday, because there was a slight timing issue on Friday, and I will be able to go into more detail about the second part of the slides. So who is here who wanted to go to the workshop at 10:30? One person. So the actual workshop will start after the coffee break, but we are still having it. Did anybody see the talk on Friday? 2 people. So I am sorry for those 3 people. I will be repeating things a little bit. I might go a bit faster over the first few slides. But yeah, who am I? My name is Emma, as Nick said, and I'm the co-founder of a small company in Belgium. We do mainly Django and Ember.js as front-end. You might know me for these 2 libraries, the RF schema adapter and Ember CLI Creditis, which are libraries that allow us to create APIs and have clients, complex clients for these APIs really easily. So why did I do this talk? If you have not seen it, last year Aaron Bassett did a talk about writing the same code, writing an Hello World API on 8 different Python frameworks. And this was a really interesting talk, but I was wondering, yes, but what about real-life cases when you have to access a database where you need authentication? You're not going to, there's some of his code that was in a single file. You're not going to do a real-life, even a microservice. Chances are you're not going to do that only in a small file, in one file. The second reason is that I've heard a lot of time people telling me, well, Django is too bloated for microservices. I'd rather use something else. And as I said, we worked mainly with Django, and this didn't sound right to me, so I wanted to try it out and see if Django was really bloated to write microservices. So why microservices? If you're not sure that you need microservice, the answer is probably that you don't need microservices. In my opinion, there are 2 real good reasons to do microservices. A, you've tried everything else, putting the database somewhere else, trying to do some load balancing, and you're still in need of more power. Your service is still too big for one single computer, for one single server. Then microservices is probably the answer for you. The second very valid reason is that your boss wants you to write microservices. So if you do need to write microservices, you're going to want a lot of different things. I'm going to go through the things I do want, and I'm going to be wearing different hats for that. So first, as a developer, I want good documentation. I said I was working a lot with Django, so I've been spoiled with good documentation, and this is something that I want everywhere. I also want a good ecosystem. It doesn't have to be really wide, but when I'm looking for something, I want to find one library, maybe 2, not 25, but I want to find libraries or plugins that do most of the common things that I would want to do with a microservice. I want to be easily able to switch between environments, like going from production to staging. If I have a problem on my production server, I want to be able to sometimes debug it. If I'm running something on my laptop in development mode, sometimes I want to switch to production mode. I want to do that easily. I also want some kind of shell access, so be able to open a shell within the framework to be able to debug things. I want auto-documenting endpoints. This is going to be really important for me, and if possible, I want also the API to be browsable so that I can try to put it in my browser directly in the documentation, see if it works or not. And I also want common project architecture or structure among all my microservices. I don't want to have to relearn to have something different every time I switch from one microservice to another. Because of course, if I'm doing microservices, I'm not going to do one, I'm going to do 5, 10, 20. And I don't want to have to launch 20 projects to be able to work on my thing. Now, as a sysadmin, I want slightly different things. As a sysadmin, I still want to have good documentation, because if someone wakes me up at 3 a.m. and I have a problem, I want to be able to open some documentation and find a solution to my problem. I also want some good tooling and software, something that's common, widespread, and that is easily available. I want managed processes. I don't want to have to start my microservice by hand somewhere and have something magically make sure that it's still running. I want logging, and I also want things that I wanted as a developer, like switching easily between environments. So if there is a problem on the production server, maybe I want to enable some debugging more easily and things like that. And I also want hot reload, so being able to just change something and tell the service to reload. What do I want as a product owner? As a product owner, I also want things common with other people in my team, but I do want to have a widespread framework, because if I have a developer who quits, I want to find somebody to replace them easily, and I don't want to have to teach them a whole framework. It's nicer if they already know the job. I also want good documentation, because that will make the job of my team easier. I also want a common project architecture or setup, because once again, I want to be able to take people in my team and move them from working on one microservice to the other without having them to relearn everything. I would love to avoid bike shedding, because there's no productivity in that. And I do want some performance, but this is probably not my main goal. If I'm looking into microservices, either it's because it's a buzzword and I want to ride the bus and use microservices, but it might also be because I do need performance, but if I needed a lot of performance, I would probably not be looking into Python. So I do want some performance, but not too much. I want some documented APIs, auto-documented APIs as well, like developers, but not for the same reason. I want to use this auto-documentation as contracts between microservices, so that if there is a problem, there's not a game of back and forth saying, hey, it's the other team problem, they're not sending me this. Oh, but no, we said we were never going to be sending this, and that's documented APIs are really important. And of course, I want some testing, because as the product owner, I want to be sure that when something is shipped, it works correctly. So for what did I do? So I came up with a test case that I wanted to try out, real-life test case, which is a web shop that's going to have 4 small microservices. It's going to have an addition services that just takes numbers and gives back the sum. This is probably not actual real-life microservice, but at least it does something else that's saying hello world. And it's got no database, no authentication. That's the important point. Another microservice that I got running was the catalog, which has access to a database but doesn't need authentication to list the products that the shop has available. And then there are things that need authentication, like a central authentication service and an order creation service that will need to authenticate to verify the authentication from another service, get catalog information for the second service, and do the billing inside its own thing with access to a database. That's the most complicated service that we're going to be looking at. So frameworks, which frameworks did I want to try? So Aaron told me that it was not a good idea to write 8 times the same piece of code with 8 different frameworks. So I didn't choose 8 different frameworks, I only chose 4. but that's still not a good idea. But now it's done. So the first framework I tried is Flask, because when you talk about microservices in Python, a lot of people say, hey, do it in Flask, you can do it in one file. So Flask I see as the nothing included service framework, sorry. It's really freeform. You can basically do what you want. You put your files the way you want. You do what you want. There is no boilerplate. And there's also a wide ecosystem. You can type Flask and then the type of thing that you want to do, and you will get 5 libraries. Which for me is a slight problem, the fact that you get 5 libraries. I would love to get 1. So having 5 libraries is sometimes a bit of a problem. Even though it's freeform, the preferred database backend is SQL Alchemy. Well, not backend, but the database layer is, the preferred database layer is SQL Alchemy, and the preferred authentication layer is OAuth 2. And if you didn't know, Flask was started as a joke. Someone said, hey, you really want something, a web framework that doesn't do anything for you? Here's Flask. This is how it started. Then people took to it, and it stayed. So the second framework we're going to be looking at is going to be Pyramids. Pyramids, I'm saying, is the hand crank framework. It's still very freeform as Flask, but it has a lot more guidelines. You could do things in another way, but Pyramid tells you, hey, it's better if you do it this way. And you end up with projects that are more similar from one place to another, from one company to another, because there is some guidelines that you can follow. There's good documentation. There's also a wide ecosystem, less scattered than for Flask. And as Flask, it tells you that it's better if you use SQL Alchemy and OAuth 2 for database and authentication. The next one that we're going to be looking at is Django. So Django is the batteries included framework. Unfortunately, you need a special charter for those batteries because Django doesn't use SQL Alchemy. It has its own ORM. It also has its own authentication system, which works great, but is different than what the rest of the Python world is doing. But it's got really great documentation. It's got a wide ecosystem with usually only 1 or 2 libraries that do the same thing. And yeah, that's Django. It's really opinionated too. It tells you, hey, this is where you put your files. Don't try putting them anywhere else. You may want to try to do it, but you will have problems. So the next framework is FastAPI. FastAPI is an asynchronous web framework. It's really young, and it's kind of the solar panel included framework, meaning that it works well, but you will have to do some wiring yourself because it's not there, but you did get the solar panel with it. It's really opinionated too. It's got good documentation. What is documented is well documented. If you want to start something, you will find all the documentation you want, but of course it's still a young framework, so you will not find tutorial on complex cases and things like that. It also has already a small ecosystem of a few libraries that work really well with it. And it also uses, it also tells you to use SQL Alchemy and OAuth 2 for SQL and authentication. Although even if it tells you how to do services, you will have to write your own user code and everything that goes with it. It's still manual wiring on that front. So next we're going to see how this fares with my requirements that I listed before. For the documentation and ecosystem, Django clearly wins. Django has a great documentation. The ecosystem is really wide, and it only has 1 library for each problem, which is really nice. Flask is a bit of a headache because it does have a lot of documentation. You want to do a blog with Flask, you will find 25 posts that tell you how to do a blog. The only problem is that none of these 25 posts will tell you to do it the same way. They will have each a different way of doing it. So when you follow one tutorial for something and you follow how to guide for something else, you will notice that you have a totally different architecture between the two tutorials and you will not know what to do unless you're really already experienced with Flask. Piroom is a bit like Switzerland. It's neutral. It's got good guidelines, but it's got less guidelines than Django, but it still has guidelines. And then FastAPI is scarce but good, so it has fewer things, fewer documentation, fewer libraries, but everything I found is good. Shell access, it is built into Django, Flask, and Pyroom's development servers. For FastAPI, it is missing, but for now you can just import your FastAPI in a Python shell and it will work. I'm thinking that later in time there will be some more advanced features. So, auto documentation of endpoints, which was something that was really important. This is something that you get out of the box in Django and FastAPI, which is great. The only thing is right now the API in documentation in FastAPI, you cannot plug in your payload and press straight. This should be fixed soon because they're using Redoc as a presentation layer, which is an external library, and there is an issue open in there to add the try it button, so it should be fixed soon. It is quite easy in Piroom. It's in the documentation if you want to do it, how to do it. It's in the documentation. It uses library. It works on the first try. In Flask, it's fast. There's also a library. There's also documentation, but when you try it, you see that you're missing some pieces that you have to do by hand. But it still works. But once again, in Flask, you will need a bit more knowledge to be able to fix it. Testing framework, everything is Python. They all recommend using unit tests, but if you want to, you can use other testing frameworks like PyTest and things like that. The only one that really pushes you to write a test, though, is Django. They create an empty test.py file for each application you create, which is nagging you, hey, please write test. That's the only one that does that. So, going to the common project architecture, we have really different philosophies depending on the framework. Django, it really doesn't give you a choice. It says, hey, this is how you're going to be organizing your files. I'm doing it for you. You just have to fill in the files. Go ahead. Pyroom is a bit like that too. It uses cookie cutters to help you start a project. This is how it's documented on the website. But they give you different cookie cutters depending on the kind of projects you want to write. So you can have different architectures, but it's still all very documented and opinionated. No, Flask and FastAPI, you can do whatever you want. If you want to create a file that's called app.py and put everything in there, you can, which sounds nice if you want to try something, but if you want to write a microservice that has to live for 5 years and have a team working on, might not be that great. Anyway, whichever project you want to use, once you have decided on the libraries that you want to use and everything, it's probably a good idea to create a cookie cutter with everything from your microservice in there and use that instead of whatever other preferred way there is to start a project. You will have all your dependencies already installed, everything. That's going to be really useful. So common tooling and software, manage process and auto reload. This is all for the sysadmin, and this is in a global thing because Django, Flask, and Piroom all use WSGI application. So since there's a Whiskey application, it can run under uWhiskey, which proposes all those features, and that's great. No, FastAPI, being asynchronous, is not Whiskey, it's ASCII. The A stands for asynchronous. And right now there are some solutions. The website for FastAPI recommends using UVicorn, which is not a process manager, it runs on its own. It can run with GUnicorn or with Supervisor. So there are ways to get it working, but it's not as straightforward as with Django or Flask, where you can just install uWhiskey from your distribution. You create the distribution file, the configuration file, and everything works for you. With FastAPI, you will have to get your hands dirty because it will not be in your server's distribution. So logging, all those frameworks use the standard Python logging. Some of the frameworks provide other libraries for advanced logging, which are really nice. Some documentation on logging is better for some frameworks than others. Once again, Django is way at the top for documentation. Yeah, level varies, but it's Python logging, so you can go back to the Python documentation on logging and you will get everything you need. So for easy switch between environments, we've got Piroom is the clear winner. When you start a Piroom project, it creates 3 different files for 3 different environments. You can create as many as you want. It's really easy to switch between one to the other. The other projects, Flask, Django, and FastAPI, they all have something for you to switch from environment to the other, but there are guidelines and stuff. There is no clear direction from the main project, but in any of those frameworks, you can find a way to do that easily or not. FastAPI is probably the worst for now. Once again, it's a really young project, so maybe they will improve in the future. Bike shedding, unfortunately, we will have bike sheddings because we are all humans. And humans like to be right, and usually 2 humans don't consider the same thing to be the right thing. So there will be some, the more opinionated your framework is, the less bike shedding there will be, because the framework is taking the decisions for you and not your team. So when you're going to be writing maybe 10 or 15 microservices, as far as I'm concerned, it's a good idea to go with the opinionated solutions, because you're going to have 15 times the same discussion about how to do this or that. And if the framework has already decided for you, it's easier on yourself. But although it is opinionated, there's still some room for bike shedding in FastAPI because it's using more pure Python, so it opens the door to, oh, what is more Pythonic, doing this or doing that, which is another issue. But yeah, it's opinionated, so it still gives you some guidelines. So now all those microservices is basically probably why you're here. I installed them on a Raspberry Pi, on 4 Raspberry Pi, that run on an isolated network, and I wanted to do some performance testing. So to do that, I used Locust, which is a Python library that you tell it how many users you want, and it starts creating user and making requests. You create scenarios, and it starts making requests. Fortunately, it is a bit limited, so for example, it will tell you that it's doing 400 requests per second, but there is 10% error. It will not tell you when it starts getting errors, so you will not know exactly the number. You have to try and guess and say, okay, I'm going to try with 2,000 users and then 5,000 users and see when things starts breaking down. So I've put all those microservices on Pis, and I looked at the statistics. So for all microservices framework, there is very little performance difference. Here for no database and no authentication, you get between 350 and 400 requests per second before things start breaking down. But if you're using FastAPI, which is asynchronous, you do use 50% of the CPU. All the other frameworks use 100% of the CPU at that point. And surprisingly, Django is the one who uses the less RAM. So back to this assumption that Django is too bloated for microservices, well, maybe not. No, it uses the less RAM. It's a few megs, it's tens of megs. But when you are running things on a Pi that only has 1 gig of RAM, 10 megs can make a difference. If you use a database, you go down to about 125 requests per second. All frameworks are still very much equal except FastAPI, which tends to fall down. This is probably because right now they're using SQL Alchemy, which is synchronous, and they're asynchronous. Tom Christie is working on a databases library that is going to be asynchronous. I'm expecting this to fix the problem. Right now, it doesn't work well under load, but it's still under development. And of course, these numbers are probably limited by the fact that I use SQLite as a database server, because I didn't want to start messing with having external database and things. I went the easy way with SQLite, so you probably can get better results if you're using PostgreSQL on another server or something like that. And finally, when you want to do things more complicated with a service that checks an authentication with another service, then asks for a list of products to a second service before doing the billing and things like that, things start slowing down under 100 requests per second. And that's, of course, we're still running on a Pi, which is a really limited system, but it also comes from the network overhead, because now your Raspberry Pi has to make requests, 2-3 requests before being able to answer, and you start probably being limited by the network. I didn't do advanced network monitoring for this or anything, so I'm not sure the network really caps things, but this is the way it looks, the way it feels from the test I've done. FastAPI, though, is really good as it's asynchronous for this kind of thing. Once you are starting to make requests to other services and stuff, well, it's asynchronous, it handles that kind of things better, and it fares better than the other service provider. It fares better than the other networks. And so, conclusions, use whatever you want. It doesn't really matter after all. Whatever you're comfortable with is probably the best solution to go. And if your preferred solution is Django, it is not too bloated. If your preferred solution is asynchronous, yeah, go for it. If you have questions, we will not do that here. We will do that after the break in room I, where we can go more into details about the workings of all these services, look maybe at some code and things like that.